Final session, and we're going to be very tight on time. So like Andreas, I'm not going to say anything at the start, but just get straight into it. Just to say, this session is on digital markets again, but different perspectives on digital markets, three excellent speakers. And we will start with Joe Perkins, who I've known for many years, and he's been an economist both in the public sector and a senior economist in both the public sector and the private sector. He's currently at FTI Consulting.
Good. Thanks very much, Amelia. Let me just see if this will... Oh, there we go. Fantastic. So thanks very much for the invitation, and particularly to Sean and Amelia for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. This is pretty preliminary work, I should warn people, which I think makes it all very exciting, but also means that this may change a bit before we get to a kind of final paper. These are also personal views. I kind of do work for FTI Consulting and also at Queen's College, Cambridge, various affiliations of the co-authors there, the two Peters and Subo. So not to be associated with those organisations. I should say a name that isn't there, which is Tom Fish, or isn't there at the moment at least, which is Tom Fish, who the genesis for a lot of this work came from Tom when he was at Generate, who I'll explain a bit more who they are in a moment, and so very grateful for all Tom's kind of work and input on it. Particularly grateful because Tom told me a moment ago it's his son's first birthday today, and he is missing some of the birthday party, which made me feel very guilty. So thank you for coming along, Tom. Okay, so that's the kind of preliminaries, I guess. Let me talk about the substance. We are looking at default settings and how they affect consumer choice and consumer behaviour. This is, you've probably seen quite a few of these, but an example of status quo bias, of course, potentially a superior technology that people are used to a particular option, and so carry on doing so even if they've got maybe a superior alternative. And this, of course, is a pretty well-known phenomenon in the sort of economics or broadly economics literature dating back to people like Kahneman and Tversky, but an idea that defaults shape user behaviour, partly due to cognitive limitations, maybe due to inertia, maybe due to people taking the existence of a default as a sort of suggestion that default is something that is the right choice, something that people should be choosing. And there's been lots of work on defaults in lots of different settings, particularly in the financial sector, actually. So things like people sticking with their existing insurance plans or savings plans, for instance. It was a big motivation in the UK, a big motivation for auto-enrolment in pensions, for instance, was a sense that people had quite strong default biases, and so you wanted to give them a default that might be beneficial for them. And I think in general, there's lots of results, of course, about default biases, but in general, we might expect biases to be particularly pronounced where we've got low stakes and frequent use situations. So for instance, think back to that investment, the auto-enrolment case. Each individual month, for instance, of making an investment into a pension scheme, it might not matter too much to you. You might not care too much, but actually cumulative, that can make a very big difference. And in the search engine case, people are making lots and lots of searches on a daily basis, and each of those individual searches, it might not be worth you switching to a different search engine, but cumulatively the welfare benefit switching could, in principle at least, be quite high. And there's concerns that being the default could significantly enhance usage and entrench market shares of those firms that get that default status, raising then, of course, regulatory concerns about competition and whether dominant positions are sustained by these sort of behavioural factors. This has come up in lots of contexts. I'll actually say a little bit more about a few others in a moment, but there's a quote there from the CMA's online platform study about 5 years ago now. Default behaviour by consumers has had a profound impact on the shape of competition in both search and social media. Defaults play a very important role in influencing consumers' use of search engines. That was particularly actually in the context of Google as a default search engine on mobile, slightly different setting from the one I'll be talking about in a moment, but obviously potentially similar issues. So, what are we doing? Well, what we're trying to do is to improve the causal evidence on how defaults are affecting consumer behaviour in that search engine context. And we're doing that. We've got a randomized field experiment with a UK-based tech company, that's Generate, which provide tools, including browsers, that allow users to control and monetize their data. And what happened in the experiment was that users were randomly assigned a default search engine, which was either Bing or Google. So we have pretty clean identification, we hope at least, of the default effects. I'll obviously say much more about this, but preliminary findings showed strong default effects, i.e. people preferred to stick, or they stuck much more with their default than purely as if they could just switch equally, might suggest. Most of the switching that did happen, perhaps not surprisingly, was from Bing to Google, but it's by no means complete. And there are some interactions between default effects and some other interesting factors in the model, such as, factors we knew about the users, such as demographics. I think one interesting result that kind of builds off that initial one, though, is that perhaps contrary to our initial expectations, the default search engine didn't affect usage of the browser. I.e., you could have Google or Bing as your default, and that would be affecting, that seems a fiddly phone. You could have a default search engine, and that would be affecting which search engine you use, but it wouldn't be causing you not to use the browser at all. You wouldn't think, oh God, that's my Bing browser, so I'm just not going to use it. Actually, we didn't find any significant effect on usage of the browser. Okay, I'm not going to say too much, partly because I've already hinted at it, but on the literature, there's obviously lots in the kind of overall nudge space here. I will, though, just mention the bottom two papers, which are both quite recent and directly relevant papers. So, Decarolis et al., they are looking at a natural experiment based on policy changes in the EEA, Russia and Turkey, related to Google's ability to be the default search engine on Android, basically. And interestingly there, they find actually quite different impacts in those different areas. So really small impacts on Google's market share in the EEA, at least from what they could find, but quite large impacts in Russia and Turkey. And I think my reading of that paper, there were basically two factors influencing that. One was obviously the detailed design of things like choice screens mattered a lot. Amelia has written a lot on this in the past, that those kind of potentially relatively trivial design choices can have quite big impacts. But two was actually just the strength of the competitors. In Russia and Turkey, there were stronger competitors, so perhaps more viable other search engines to switch to. Another very recent paper by Hunt Alcott and others, they have this is an MBR paper so far, but they have a field experiment based on offering payments to participants to use Bing rather than Google. Most participants would prefer to use Google, but they offered payments to say, okay, how much would you need to switch over to use Bing? They find that there's a potential trade-off between short-run consumer surplus, which might be maximised by choice screens, because short-run consumer surplus might be maximised for most people by choosing Google, and potentially, maybe you might think of this competition effects, but at least increasing the market share of the challenger effects, which might be maximised by allowing the challenger to be the default, so allowing Bing to be the default. One other result there, and I'll perhaps come back to that bit in my talk, but they also found that once people started using Bing, they needed less money to stick with Bing, which might suggest some sort of learning effects that people liked Bing more as they used it a little bit more. Okay, this has also, of course, been as a subject of lots of regulatory and court actions. Just a summary of a few there. Most recently, and still ongoing in terms of remedies, the US case versus Google. Department of Justice accused Google of monopolistic practices by paying to be the default, and the judgment found that it had done so. That's summary of a long section in the judgment, but the exclusive agreements cause anti-competitive effects in the general search services market. The key issue there, which we don't really cover here, I might say one or two words about it, but the key issue there was whether the defaults, not just how big are default effects, but also whether those defaults then constitute anti-competitive behaviour because they might be leveraging biases to suppress rivals. I will make one or two comments on that, but that's not the kind of core focus of what we have so far. Okay, so experiment design. This is dear old Generate. If you learn nothing more from this, you'll learn about Generate, who I think are a great fun company and were really good to work with on this. So they're a relatively small tech company with the idea of basically helping people to monetize their data. So the broad motivation was, oh, people are handing over lots of their data to companies like Google and Facebook. We're going to help people to share their data for money, essentially. And so this is, you can go to their website, you can download their browser. Their browser comes with a default search engine, which can be either Google or Bing. Typically and historically it's been Google most of the time, but it could obviously be either, or it could be DuckDuckGo or whatever. And from a Generate perspective, they were interested in what was the effect of adopting a different default search engine. For instance, if they had Bing as their default search engine, would this suddenly mean no one wants to use their browser and so their business is in trouble, or would it have a much more limited effect? I should say it's PC users only, so we weren't looking at tablets and mobiles. So we were defining two groups. One was what we called the control group. Those are users who got the Generate browser with Google as the default search engine. So they didn't get a choice screen, just to be clear, they got Google as the default. And the other is what we call the treatment group here, users getting Bing as a default search engine. This was run over the course of just over 6 months in 2023, and then we had a little bit of post-experiment observation as well. I think one important note here is that we didn't observe user search activities on other browsers. So we didn't see, they might have been treating the Generate browser as their Bing browser, for instance, and then using another browser for Google. That's just not something we were able to observe in this experiment. I won't spend too long on the user characteristics. I don't know whether you'd be surprised by this, but much more men than women were downloading. We had good data on things like gender and age, less good data on things like income. Yes, age categories, again, skewed relatively young. A lot of the others, we had sort of less good data, so I'm not going to say too much about those. This again doesn't really say much, but we were tracking usage of the browsers, and we had quite fairly detailed data on actually how people were using the browser over this period of about 8 months in total. I should say it's also got pretty strong weekly seasonality, so people are using the browser more during the week than at weekends, perhaps not surprisingly. In total we had just over 6,000 installations, so about 3,000 or just over 3,000 with Bing as default and with Google as default, so a reasonable data set to draw some inferences, we thought. And most of the events we saw were web searches, but also things like opening a new window, also some rarer events, but things like clicking on links, running the browser, all that kind of thing. Okay, that's all really preamble. This is starting to get a little bit more interesting. This is looking at how user characteristics related to switching by the study participants. Basically, you're significantly more likely to switch if you're high income rather than low income, so more likely to change browser if you're high income. Relatively small differences between men and women. More likely to switch if you were not working compared to working. And then also more likely to switch if you kept using the browser, so that's customer retained versus customer left. Perhaps not surprising there that people who are using the browser perhaps quite intensively were more likely to change their default. You might think more likely to optimize for the browser they really wanted. One thing, I won't say too much about region. It's not in there, so I won't say it now, but I'll maybe come back to it. What would we a priori expect in this context? Well, baseline, of course, this market is not some beautiful, free, perfectly functioning market. of course, but this might give at least some sense of a baseline of what we might expect of a balance between Google and Bing. You probably can't quite see that there, but we've got about 84% of desktop search engine market share in Europe for Google. Well, it's about 9%, I think, for Bing, and then you've got a bunch of smaller browsers picking up the remainder. So, in other words, we would, if this were just assume that this is a competitive setting, which may be a heroic assumption, but if this is a competitive setting, you might expect that 84 to 9% ratio to be played out across the, for both the treatment group and the control group. What did we actually find? Well, we found actually pretty high market share, essentially, for Bing over time. Declining a bit over time, so Bing is that sort of green block there, Google is the blue block. Not surprising, of course, that Google is getting a higher share than Bing, given what we know about the a priori figures, but this is nothing like 84 to 9%. What do the switchers do? There are some switchers here. What are the switchers doing? Again, perhaps not surprisingly, the bulk of those are going from Bing to Google. That's a big flow there towards the top. But you do also have some switching actually from Google to Bing, but then also some switching to smaller browsers as well. I won't go into this, it's fairly obvious from that chart really, but Google is gaining from switching here, again, maybe not surprisingly. But I think that obviously does have policy implications. If you think about interventions such as choice screens, in the current market setting, it's quite plausible that Google benefits from choice screens relative to other search engines. Then that kind of question that Tom and Generate were sort of interested in from the start, are users being retained? Actually, no measurable impact on user retention. So this is looking at the kind of share of leavers based upon whether they were assigned to Google, so that's the green in this case actually, or whether they're assigned to Bing, the blue here, and basically it's pretty close to 50% throughout. And if we looked at 4 weeks after installation, about 60% of users were still using the browser after 4 weeks, whether or not they had been initially assigned to Bing or Google. Now, of course, quite a lot, as that chart earlier suggested, quite a lot of those people who were initially assigned to Bing had in the meantime switched over to Google, so they were using Google, but they were still using the browser. So importantly, from Tom's perspective and from Generate's perspective, but actually you might think, possibly importantly, if you think about wider competition and ecosystem effects, right? Because what this says is that, okay, at least for this particular user group, it says that a firm could come in and offer a browser, perhaps strike an exclusivity deal with Bing, for instance, and it would not lose market share as a result of doing that, right? So that's potentially quite an important point, I think, in terms of the wider competitive effects. Yeah. Okay, this sort of really just summarizes everything we found. So we didn't quite achieve perfect randomization, I'm afraid, just over 50% for Google and just under for Bing. Of those, you've got quite big flows that did not return from both the Google and Bing defaults, quite big flows from Bing to Google, and then some flows from Google, obviously from Google to Google, also from Bing to Bing. That's what we're seeing as a default effect, and some people moving elsewhere as well. Okay, so overall, what were we finding? Well, as I said at the beginning, what we're trying to do is to provide more causal evidence on the impacts of defaults, how defaults are affecting consumer behavior, and doing it through a new data set, through a new field experiment. I haven't seen anything quite like this in any of the existing literature. We were finding pretty strong default effects, with most of that switching, quite a lot of switching happening, but certainly by no means complete, and most of that from Bing to Google. And the default search engine didn't seem to affect at least on a binary measure, the usage of the browser. I think I just would flag up a few limitations here. One is, as I've already mentioned, we didn't observe all of that search activity. So it could be that people are using other browsers for Google searches or similar. We're also not cleanly studying at the impact of the default, because we're not comparing between people having a choice screen versus having Bing as a default versus maybe having Google as a default. What we're comparing is having either Google as a default or Bing as a default. So everyone has a default in this setting. Third, and this is obviously pretty, kind of, when you think about it for a moment, of course, the user base here might be pretty atypical, right? This is people who are prepared to download a browser from a pretty small tech company with an unusual and interesting but somewhat unusual business model. That might not apply across the wider population, of course. And then the final is just a catch-all caveat that we still want to do some more work on this. Okay, thanks very much.
Very interesting indeed. Obviously, very intuitive. I mean, it's intuitively very plausible in that it fits with other evidence as well. But I think that it's a really neat way of analysing and showing it. Questions, and it'll be quite limited questions. So yes, Russell.
Can you put back up the slide with the different incomes and age?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry, I raced over that one.
I think you can pass it.
I think it's
Is this the one you wanted? Or
No.
The effect.
the switching one?
Yeah. This.
There we are. Yeah. Is that the one? Or?
Am I right that almost none of the results are statistically significantly different from zero?
I would not want to draw that conclusion at this stage. That's what I would say, because this is pretty preliminary analysis, right?
But for example, the ones you
there are
analyzed.
large standard errors.
Okay, so the ghost of my econometrics professor tells me to object that you say there's a difference between high income and low income. What you've shown is they're all zero or no difference.
Yeah. So we have tested, the only thing I think we've tested so far is this, right? So we have not found a statistically significant difference, and this is quite tightly estimated as well. So if the true difference had been, let's say, 4 percentage points or something, we would have picked it up. So this we have kind of tested, we think, reasonably rigorously, but the kind of relationships with demographics, frankly, at the moment, those are up there to give you something mildly interesting to look at. I wouldn't say they're rigorous at this stage.
Just made me a scold, but I apologize.
No. You're quite right to raise it. Yeah.
Kobe.
Yeah, I wasn't 100% sure how to interpret the treatment, right? So do you have information on what browsers these people used before they got yours as a default? So
they are not... Some of these people are using the Generate browser very rarely, right? So they are basically, it's people going to the Generate website and they've maybe seen advertising or something else, right? Yeah. Maybe word of mouth, and deciding, I want to download the Generate browser, right? And they might be using that browser. I'm pretty sure that quite a lot of them are using that browser, as well as using Chrome or whatever other, lots of other different browsers, right? Mozilla, whatever. So it's not that they are necessarily using this instead of another browser. Some of them will be, and they've got financial incentives to use the Generate browser relative to other browsers.
Yeah.
But we're not, we don't monitor the participants' use of other browsers.
Yeah. Now, the reason why I'm asking is kind of there are different ways of interpreting also the default effects, and some of the natural experiments we've had, there's at least one that is also in the case. What you see is that the inertia kind of goes in both directions, so that essentially you have a couple of people who don't really care about what browser they use. Now that interpretation is really important for thinking about what the efficiency effects are on the consumer side, and then of course you have to think about the advertising efficiency.
Yeah, so what you might interpret from this kind of summary figure here, right, is that there's a bunch of people, let's say it's about a third of the users of Bing, for instance, who rate Google quite a lot more highly than Bing, but it's not that costly for them to switch, so they switch, right? And then there's a bunch of people, you know, maybe another third or so of the users of Bing who actually don't really care, right? Bing's my default, Google could have been my default, DuckDuckGo could have been my default, it doesn't really matter. So yeah, we're not, and this is actually a bit different. I mentioned the Alcott et al. Paper because they're paying people to use Bing rather than Google. They have a measure of intensity of preferences there. We don't have that measure of intensity here, but certainly, you know, the assumption, of course, would be is that people who are switching care more about this than people who are not.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm excited about this talk first. Friso is from Tilburg University, and he's going to be talking about ecosystem entanglement, which I think he may have invented.
Yeah.
But I'm excited to hear about it.
Thank you so much for having me at the conference and for chairing, Amelia. So indeed, I'll talk about ecosystem entanglement. Some terminology to unpack there. I think ecosystem is something most of you are familiar with by now. Refers to this network of complementers that lives in or around a central platform. Think of say a mobile operating system and complementers being app developers, potentially device manufacturers. It also concerns end users that all revolve around it. Now, these the operators of these central platforms, call them the ecosystem orchestrators. They also provide their own complements within their ecosystem, which has been the source of quite some competition cases. But I'm concerned with something a little different, namely the relations between these ecosystems, because the orchestrators of these ecosystems also provide their complements within competing ecosystems, often with arrangements around it, for example, around default placement, something we know about now, revenue share agreements. Often they also invest in other ecosystems. They might put people on the board of the other firm. And that is what I mean when I say entanglement. So, as a lawyer, I would now just start stumbling towards a conclusion, but I'm among economists who like a better idea of the talk that's about to be had. So I put in some bullet points here about what I want to argue. The argument comes down to this. So these gatekeepers, which are, let's say, the main ecosystem orchestrators, are, I think, potentially each other's strongest competitors. Few have the resources, financial, technological, and otherwise, to really compete in these quite entrenched core platform markets. But this entanglement that I talked about, I think, softens, or has at least the potential to soften that competition. This is a problem in a time of the Digital Markets Act, because, of course, one of its two goals is this contestability, so lowering barriers to entry and seeing entry in those core platform markets. But the DMA doesn't really tackle this ecosystem entanglement. So I look at what antitrust can and should do instead. Now, maybe to make this a bit more tangible, let's start with an example. Take you back to Macworld '97, which took place in Boston. Steve Jobs had just returned to Apple to save it because it was in dire straits. And he was on stage together with Bill Gates of Microsoft, you can see in the background there. And they were announcing a new partnership. Microsoft would invest $150 million to kind of save Apple from bankruptcy. But more importantly, I think, committed to maintaining the Office suite on the Mac for at least 5 years. And well, Steve Jobs said some interesting words there that might these days raise antitrust flags. But he said that the era of setting this up as a competition between Apple and Microsoft is over, as far as he was concerned. So this is one example, but it's certainly not the exception. Beyond Apple, Microsoft, Apple has also entertained very close relationships with Google. Before it was launching the iPhone, the CEO of Google at the time, Eric Schmidt, was on the board of Apple. The iPhone then launched while Google, of course, was working on its competing Android operating system. The iPhone launched with only Apple apps, plus 2 apps of another company, namely Google, who provided Google Maps and also, of course, search as the default service on Safari, Apple's web browser. Another example is Microsoft Facebook, with Microsoft investing in Facebook, providing its ad system globally for a number of years, and so on. So this is really the dynamic I'm addressing, that platforms are key complementers, at times also investors, board members, to or in each other's ecosystems. This has been examined in literature under some different terms, co-opetition perhaps being the main one, also the idea of frenemies, both competitors but also cozying up to each other at times. Of course, the state of affairs is not entirely logical, perhaps. Theoretically, I think you'd want to, really, main ecosystem orchestrators would want to avoid this entanglement if you have a key complement that is really necessary to provide value to consumers. Of course, you'll have to share some of your rents with the provider of that complement. Also, you open yourself up to the risk of opportunism. If indeed, your competitor is providing that key complement, you can also withdraw it with an intent to foreclose, perhaps. So that's why we do see replacement of those key complements at times. Apple came up with its own mapping app after a couple of years. It also worked out its iWork suite to have at least an alternative ready for Office. But in other times, the arrangement is very stable. The most stable one perhaps is Apple, Google around search. Been going on since the launch of the iPhone in 2007, so that's 18 years and counting. But of course, given a US antitrust case that's going on, it won't go on for much longer, I think. Now, what are the effects? In this particular case, you can see kind of a likely direct effect that Apple will not build its own search engine. That one seems rather obvious, but I think there could be important ripple effects. The DMA has opened up opportunities to compete with and within each other's ecosystems, but gatekeepers have not really seized on those. Google could build a capable Chrome browser now that the DMA lets it build one without having to use Apple's own Safari WebKit browser. And of course, that could become a platform for web apps in this competing operating system, but there are no report plans to do so. Google could launch a Play Store within iOS and so on. And I think that might be, or it's been suggested, that is because, of course, that would risk or endanger the profitable arrangement they have around search. Now, this is a bit of a problem for the DMA. Like I said, the DMA pursues, in addition to fairness, contestability. It wants to see lower entry barriers, but also, I would say, making use of those lowered barriers to actually enter each other's markets. Who is going to do so in these core platform markets? I think gatekeepers, so the GAFAM plus Booking and ByteDance with TikTok at this stage, are likely each other's strongest challengers. These markets take, a lot to enter, both financially, technologically. Take something as search. If you'd want to become a real competitor there, that would be an expensive proposition. You'd likely need a search index. There's only one other firm than Google at this point, namely Microsoft, which has a competitive one. So the kind of list of challengers tends to be rather short. Now, the DMA, I think, is open to such inter-gatekeeper rivalry. You can see that when you compare the DMA with another important act, the Data Act. And that act is about data portability, but it explicitly prohibits making use of its privileges, like data sharing, between gatekeepers. So Microsoft cannot benefit from data sharing there, data from Google, for example, but under the DMA, it very much can. But as I've been arguing, that rivalry is somewhat inhibited, softened by this entanglement between ecosystems, because while they might have the ability to compete here, they might not always have the incentive. The DMA, though, doesn't have a proper solution to this, because it regulates ecosystems only internally. Take one example, the provision around choice screens. If you are an operating system gatekeeper, you have to show a choice screen for browsers, search engines, and virtual assistants, but only if you're also designated as a gatekeeper in those different markets. Now, take Apple. Apple has Safari. That's a gatekeeper browser, so it has to show a choice screen for browsers. But since for search engines, it relies on a third party, Google, even though that is the default there, it doesn't need to show a choice screen because that's a third-party arrangement. It is not part of Apple's own ecosystem complements. Now, that's a bit of a limitation, I think. You could think about removing or limiting that by amending the DMA itself, either within specific obligations or by including some kind of entanglement provision saying, well, if there is an arrangement with a third party for default placement, revenue share, and so on, that counts as the gatekeeper zone, and they would have to, insert choice and whatnot. Or you could give up competition between gatekeepers and say, well, we need to focus compliance and enforcement of the DMA to benefit startup challengers and see the opportunities there. Or, of course, a third option is to, not expect every solution from the DMA and go back to antitrust. Because I think the mechanism, at least in some of these cases, is akin to a collusive one. Essentially, what you're doing is sharing a monopoly profit, which is then higher than the respective duopoly profits. The revenue sharing arrangement that Apple and Google have to the tune of 20 or 25 billion per year. That amount is slightly higher than a scenario where Apple builds its own search engine, throws Google off. So that's what keeps this agreement stable. And of course, this expands to the markets around it, perhaps a bit akin to collusion with multi-market contacts. Now, if it is indeed collusive, you'd assess it under Article 101, the provision on restrictive agreements. The framework for assessment here is, figuring out whether something is restrictive by object or by effect, by object being sort of the shortcut, saying, the purpose of this agreement is so clearly anti-competitive that we don't need to go into all of the effects. I think some cases of ecosystem entanglement, relevant analogy is that of pay-for-delay schemes. We've heard a lot about those yesterday. They consist in paying, mostly original drug manufacturers paying generics for not entering. This is not so far removed from, paying another ecosystem lot to host your complement, and hopefully they won't come up with a similar one. So that might apply indeed to Google, Apple. Google and Meta had a deal called Jedi Blue, where Meta was about to throw its weight behind header bidding, competing ad technology, but then Google enticed it to instead use its systems by giving it privileged placement and all kinds of benefits within that system. A lot of authorities started the case there, but most of them were closed based on, administrative prioritization. So I don't have much more to say about that. But a lot of cases will be a lot more ambiguous than that one, and are likely to be categorized in this effects box, where you need to figure out what exactly the entanglement's purpose and effects are. I think we're seeing a lot of joint ventures, for example, in the AI space, where one of these gatekeepers invests, or multiple invest in AI hopefuls. We have some tools, of course, to figure out how to categorize that. If it is purely financial, there's less likely to be an efficiency benefit, at least. So we might want to give that only a quick look. But if these are productive joint ventures where the startup really benefits from cloud capacity and whatnot, will have to be a full effects analysis. We've done this at other stages, I think, rather successfully. Think about Yahoo, when that was still an effective company, but already on the decline. It was still the second largest search provider after Google, and it was looking for a partner to join up with and to let it provide its search technology. Now, I first proposed such an arrangement with Google itself, but both in Europe and the US, that was shot down based on kind of the obvious observation that combining the first and second biggest firm in a very concentrated market might not be the best idea, but allowing another arrangement or entanglement between Microsoft and Yahoo, so the second and third biggest players, was much more obviously pro-competitive, especially in a market where you need scale to be effective. So we do have relevant precedents there. Now, the assessment is one thing, and this is a high-level framework, but I think the biggest challenge in antitrust proceedings has been to craft remedies that are somewhat effective at ideally restoring competition. Now, choice screens have been perhaps the remedy of choice in digital markets, but they have problems relating both to their design, but perhaps the most important one is, I think, that they cannot be shown where they matter most. We had the Google Android case in the EU. Joe already shortly mentioned it. The remedy there was a choice screen on devices using Android, so Samsung, other phone makers. But of course not iPhones, which, well, depending on the member states, are up to half or more than half of devices. And indeed, we saw that it moved the needle by about 1%. Now, in the US case, that's now in a remedy stage. Of course, that does include not only Android phones, but also iPhones, which especially in the US are more than half of the markets. So at least the surface there is better. But the problem in that case is that this case was brought as unilateral conduct case. So in the remedy discussions going on, you can already see that a choice screen is being discussed, but not on iPhones, because Apple is simply not a party to this case. So it cannot be burdened with remedies. And those, I think, are real limitations. So what I suggest instead is, well, to impose enemy remedies. If the problem is that some of these ecosystem orchestrators are too friendly with each other, then remedies should set them up as enemies. And well, to model this on something we've seen in practice, a good example here is what happened between Google and Apple on Maps. At some point in 2012, after 5 years of Google Maps being on Apple, Google stopped updating the Google Maps app on iOS with the most interesting features, such as turn-by-turn navigation, which was then a new and presumably attractive feature. Presumably then, that was done to draw some users perhaps to Android. It led to Apple just kicking off Google Maps and coming up with its own Apple Maps. That was a painful process for both companies. Google lost most of its usage on iOS. Apple, well, at least took some reputational damage because the app was initially very bad. But because it had all these users and the associated data to help improve it, that was quickly fixed. And today, they're about equal. And I think we can be happy that there's 2 big mapping applications and not 1. So using this as sort of a model, you'd want to intervene on both sides of the entanglement, which means that you have to frame this ecosystem entanglement as collusion, as I've argued before, not just as unilateral conduct. The obvious remedy is to disentangle, meaning prohibit any contracts privileging complements within each other's ecosystem. But of course, that might not be enough. If you think of the Apple-Google case study, which I keep coming back to, well, what will Apple do once, I think, as we might expect, Google can no longer conclude these default arrangements? It might go to Microsoft and maybe hopes to get half of that 20 billion. Unclear whether Microsoft will even want to offer that, because if there's no other providers in the market, maybe the price is 0 or a symbolic dollar. But if you really want Apple to become an enemy, well, you might want it to come up with its own search engine. Then you probably need to prohibit also Apple from contracting with anyone for the provision of that complement. Again, you'd need a collusive perspective to burden both parties, but that's what I have been arguing for. Now, to wrap up, some counter arguments. Of course, one is that if you do go about it in this way, you end up strengthening ecosystems, which is something that everyone's happy with. Apple would grow another limb in its search engine, but I think that the benefits of this, namely the competition in this concentrated platform market, plus the increased competition at the ecosystem level, in this case between Google and Apple, definitely weighs up against that. And of course, there's an argument made now in court that, well, we simply won't do it. We won't compete. We won't build our own search engine. But that seems like cheap talk. If you look at the court documents, they have made their internal calculations. And for now, it's just not worth building a search engine. If with a remedy you make it worth it, then I think you can expect them to be economically rational there. So that's my take on ecosystem entanglement, and I'll be happy to hear any questions. Thank you.
Okay, short period for some questions. Tanya.
Hi, I'm Tanya, and I come from a telco perspective. And I was trying to imagine the CEO of BT Group being on the board of Virgin Media. how would that go down legally? I mean,
Sorry,
I don't
could
think-
you repeat the
how would,
CEO
how would
of?
it go down if the CEO of the UK telco incumbent went onto the board, had a board seat, at one of its largest competitors? So that seems to be the practice here, and I don't know what the legal means of avoiding that might be, but perhaps an SMS, I don't know if an SMS designation could be somehow linked to something like that. Yeah, thanks.
Actually, can I do a follow-up question on that? Because I had thought, and I'm obviously very naive here, that actually the US had stronger rules on that kind of cross-directorship than we actually did. And the main reason we didn't see too much of it here was that most companies had US activities and therefore they couldn't do it because of the US. So what I can see is that you might get, if both Google and Microsoft invest in OpenAI, for example, I don't know if they do, that they both end up with board members on OpenAI. So you get that kind of cross, but do we have any evidence of Google directors being on the Apple board and things like that?
Yeah. So in this specific case, indeed, with Google CEO Eric Schmidt being on Apple's board,
So
he was.
Oh.
He was. Back then, there was less competition between the two firms, which I think why indeed these laws that the US does have on the books on these cross-directorships were not yet applied. But when it was clear that both were working on mobile ecosystems, at that point, the FTC gave a warning, after which they ended up concluding that, those board seats. So there is something to be done against that specifically. The law hasn't really been used so much, but at least there's a sort of clear law that just needs to be enforced. I think the trickier part is, the complements kind of part of this.
Any other questions? Oh, Franco.
Actually, as a quick one, I was thinking, is this a behavior that we observe only for digital platform? What about if we take the automotive industry and we go back and these manufacturers, how many times did they have this kind of agreements in place? And are there similarities? Of course, we know there is a different market, it's digital, etc. But I'm trying to go back and say how much of this kind of strategy, trying to entrancement that we observe here, perhaps is always being there. We just had our eyes closed before. Now we say, no, we need to start opening.
Yeah, I'm probably guilty of thinking that digital markets are always kind of unique, but certainly the ecosystem concept isn't, or the platform concept is not unique to digital markets. So likely, yeah, if you have, I can't even think up what the exact analogy would be in the car sector, but similar provision, sort of cross provision of complements, board seats, and investments, I suppose would be subject to the same antitrust concerns that I've put out here.
Hi. How should we think about interoperability in this context? Because I would have thought that all else equal, interoperability is a way of softening competition. So as part of your disentanglement, you might want to go against it. But at the same time, consumers tend to like interoperability.
Yeah. So I think interoperability in itself might help provide opportunities for more mixing and matching of these services platforms by the end consumer. I think what I'm more concerned about is the kind of entanglement where it's not the end user who's choosing which services to use with each other or to switch from one service to the other, but rather the ecosystem orchestrators making that decision and that being backed by whatever default agreements, revenue shares, and so on. So interoperability in itself, I think, is promising, but that must be in sort of unencumbered interoperability.
So I just wanted to raise one extra point, which is there's a couple of other ways in which you get entanglements, which aren't through the sorts of contracts that you've described. So they're through more normal commercial relationships. So for example, I think lots of Apple devices are sold through the Amazon platform. I think that Booking.com is one of the main sources of advertising for Google. Google's search advertising. So you probably know to think, would you also try and break those, but then that potentially gets into really quite normal commercial practices?
Yeah. In the paper, I do try to make a division between the sort of, do you say by object entanglements where the purpose is kind of clear, then by effect where it's more ambiguous, and here where there are really normal relationships that by themselves are not, do not come with any privileged revenue shares, default placements. I think those might even fall sort of outside of the remit of, say, an Article 101. I mean, there is, of course, an agreement supporting this commercial relationship, but it is not in any way collusive in a strict sense. So I think it might come with some of the same factual effects, but I think the law is much more limited in what it could do there, and probably,
Possibly rightly.
Yeah, exactly. That's, yeah.
Okay, Dol, thank you very much. And last but very much not least, Stephen. Stephen is a lecturer at the Royal Holloway, University of London, and very experienced competition law.
Thank you. So, first of all, thank you very much for staying to the end. I do appreciate it. It's very nice to be here amongst many friends, old and new. So I've been asked to make a few remarks about the passage of the DMCC, the new competition law here in the United Kingdom, the complement to the Digital Markets Act in the UK, and the thing that doesn't quite exist in America because ICOA never passed. It's an interesting history. I know it's quite familiar to many people. Indeed, closest to me here is one of the panel members who was perhaps most influential in the very existence of this law in the first place. So I'm conscious of a difficulty in getting the level right between phenomenal expertise and some people whose day-to-day may not involve competition policy. So I hope to strike a middle path. If there are any questions, do please store them up for the end, or indeed stop me as I go along. The DMCC has an interesting background. So just to give you an overview, there'll be a short test afterwards, no, I'm just joking. To give you an overview, we'll go through a quick introduction just in case anyone isn't familiar with the legislation. We'll go through a very interesting episode where the CMA encountered some political pressure and essentially promised to behave itself in order to get the law passed, which I find quite interesting. We'll map back to the expert report. I'll give you some insights from the parliamentary process, and we'll highlight 4 emerging themes. I do have to make a disclosure, which is that I received some research funding from the Legatum Institute and was therefore involved in the passage of the law. From a particular perspective. I had a paper which was co-written with the former special advisor of Jacob Rees-Mogg, so it was very much one contingent of the Conservative Party who aren't particularly keen on regulation. So, without further ado, I think it's quite helpful to move on to what the DMCC tries to do, for those who may not be familiar with it. It's actually quite different from the Digital Markets Act in the European Union. There's a tendency to run them together in your mind because they sound quite similar, but it's in fact a fundamentally different approach. The Digital Markets Act in the EU is a series of bright line rules on things like interoperability, data access, bans on certain data handling, these sorts of things, whereas the DMCC is an administrative scheme. If a company is designated as having strategic market status, then an administrative scheme applies. There aren't bright line rules, they are contextual. This is a fundamental difference. Of course, the aim, as has been referred to over lunch and in many other talks, was precisely to improve contestability of digital markets, but as we heard from our regulator this morning, within bounds. This is certainly not the vulgarized account that more competitors means more competition, so let's just get lots of competitors, the so-called N+1 argument. Of course, it's not that, but it is trying to address things. The phrase that's often used is at the root of their cause. So there are quite a few interesting things. If we look at some of the new powers, there was a huge debate as the law passed about judicial review, which we'll come back to, and it masked actually some much more significant innovations for the regulator. For example, a power to create, not only to obtain, information. For example, an ability to require the commissioning of reports by designated parties, even getting them to pay for it, which I thought was quite a capture risk if you get Facebook to pay for its own report. To be fair to the CMA, that's only possible legally if terms of reference have been set before, so it's not as great a capture risk as it sounds. And the rules themselves can be very wide-ranging, in particular the so-called, so there are two main rules, just in case anyone's new to this, codebook rules, as I think of them, which are essentially a regulatory rule, but they're addressed to one firm, which is a real sort of administration and adjudication blend. More in terms of regulation, there's something called a pro-competitive intervention, closely modelled on the Enterprise Act, and inheriting the very expansive remedies from the Enterprise Act. So these things are no joke. It's a bit like the DMA, but without any particular guardrails. We'll get to some guardrails in a bit. As you'd imagine, this was very controversial because of the breadth of what I've just described. So in January 2024, we found this interesting document, which is on the left, the overview of the CMA's provisional approach to implement the digital markets regime. A remarkable document because the law hadn't been passed yet. It was encountering some political headwinds, as I mentioned, and the CMA at some level promised to behave itself. Maybe a kinder way to put that is that it promoted transparency before the law was even passed. But I can't emphasize enough that the law actually came reasonably close not to passing. In the end, with the election, it nearly timed out. It was only just preserved. So we might be in a world where we all had talked about this for years and it never actually passed. In fact, it did pass. Another major stop, I mean, earlier we had reference to the 4 Ps, which is some guidance from the agency on transparency and proportionality. Another one that I would highlight is the 7th of January appearance by the CMA CEO and the Digital Markets Unit head at the House of Lords, at one of the committees there, which provided a degree of guidance, essentially that the CMA will be a bit slower and more methodical, and I mean that positively, compared with the Digital Markets Act, where so many companies have come to be designated. On the contrary, the CMA is being measured. It's taking forward just currently 2/3, depending on how you count them, Google search, Apple and Google mobile ecosystems, which is a refresh from an Enterprise Act study and investigation. And it's said that there will be one for cloud. This is quite different from what's happened in Brussels, where there was suddenly all these designations. Last month we saw everyone going to court. So it's a slightly more targeted approach. And of course it reflects underneath it all the intellectual genesis, and we have one of the panel members here, of course, Professor Fletcher, also Jason Furman and several others, referred to as the Furman Report or Furman Review, Unlocking Digital Competition. I think it's helpful to track back to exactly what this report said and did not say. In fact, what came forward in legislation was quite different in some regards, not all, but in some regards, from what the report had said. So the 3 points I would highlight are what exactly is targeted. It was clearly agreed in the process that there would be a targeted regime. It's clearly addressed to particular firms, and it's clearly digital specific. Okay, but what exactly is it? Is it based on absolute or relative market power? This is really understated in all of the documentation from Furman to the parliamentary debate, to the law itself, to the guidance that's been passed under it. If it's about absolute market power, then it follows that you would need to prove some kind of power in relation to some of the abilities to intervene that's more traditional in character. Now, those familiar with the debate will say, of course it's asymmetric, that was the point, why are you raising this? But in fact, as I do in the paper, there's an update to the paper, by the way, which I can provide if anyone wants it. If you actually go through the guidance and the law, you'll find that it is equivocal on whether it's symmetric or asymmetric market power. Quite shrewdly, perhaps, the DMU has retained an ability to use either symmetric or asymmetric evidence of market power. And this will sound terribly geeky, but it's actually quite important because it determines whether you can intervene purely on behalf of competitors. And it's quite reassuring in a way, to see that there is still symmetric market power and not only asymmetric market power focus. Consumer welfare, this is the one everyone tends to understate because there's such a powerful lobby, particularly from app developers who really, really want N+1 competition, and it was, of course, my job, as I referred to beat them back. So I'd like to quote from the Furman Review itself, which said, "Policy should remain based on careful weighing of economic evidence and models. Consumer welfare is the appropriate perspective to motivate competition policy, and a completely new approach is not needed." Full stop. In other words, the recommendations on which the Act was based were expressly about retaining a consumer welfare approach. You may be thinking, why? The reason was that the concern was speed, not substance. A closely related reason was that there's a lot of expertise around consumer welfare, a lot of expertise around proving effects, and therefore it would be a mistake to have some kind of impressionistic competition policy that doesn't use evidence. One thing you may notice as a theme in DMU statements, and I'm proud to say that a former student of mine is actually in one of the teams, he always loves to say, and his colleagues do as well, we love evidence, we're evidence-based. Right? And I think that's really admirable. This is not N+1 competitors. Point 3 was the one that predominated in the public debate, judicial review, but I think it was in some ways, I wouldn't say inconsequential, it was important, but it got too much bandwidth. The essential problem was whether there would be an appeal reflecting adjudication or judicial review reflecting regulation. And because the Act blends adjudication and regulation, there could be no elegant answer. In the end, there was a halfway house, which essentially allows people to appeal fines and some of the things supporting fines, and there's a detailed legal analysis of that in the paper if anyone wants it. I thought we'd go to a particular snapshot in time to give you a feel for how it was when this went through Parliament. So the people I was working with got quite some headway in autumn of 23. We got through some quite helpful amendments. Sir Robert Buckland, was particularly helpful, and all of that, of course, is in the parliamentary record. If you can't sleep and you want to go and have a look, you can see exactly where we put things in and where we weren't able to convince people, and it was all good sport. And of course, the thing with the parliamentary process is there will always be a blowback. That happened in January 24. It's quite interesting. So at the time, I'd like to highlight 3 things. I knew that what would come was an assault on consumer welfare. And happily, I found myself at a conference where the CEO of the CMA was speaking. She had been in town to visit tech companies and to reach out to them. And I asked the question, why was it that consumer welfare was downplayed when it's such a strong emphasis in the Furman report? It received an answer. Now, to be diplomatic, I might say possibly I misunderstood it. The answer was that you wouldn't normally expect to see consumer welfare in a competition law. I sat up in my chair a bit because I'm not sure that's legally accurate. I may have misunderstood. For instance, Section 134(6) of the Enterprise Act requires a remedy to prove a consumer benefit. For example, Section 18 of the Competition Act refers to consumers, for example. Section 46, or Clause 46 as it was in House of Lords Bill 12 at the time, refers to users and customers, which I say is close enough, and most strikingly of all, the title of the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Act refers to consumers. So that will sound terribly unkind, but I don't see what the problem is with showing that at least indirectly there's a consumer benefit from what you're doing. Otherwise, what are you doing? What are you really doing with this law if you can't show at least indirectly that you're helping the consumer? But I think that very sharp criticism has perhaps been overtaken, because at the end of the day, the DMU's posture is quite clearly, within reason and with some exceptions, to focus on consumers. There is a strong consumer emphasis in current matters. So back in England, the lobbyists, or as it were, the other side came along, and they had some interesting proposals. If you want to look in the paper, you'll see that this is but one page of the interesting things which it was suggested primarily by the Liberal Democrats, particularly Lord Clement Jones, who pushed for some quite remarkable things, some of them sensible, some of them perhaps a bit pushy. I'll highlight the pushy ones. Pre-notification of all worldwide product launches, really, if you're a designated firm. Now this, to an economic audience, of course, will just sound insane, and it's the sort of thing that we were fighting back against. Some more nuanced ones, engagement with technical standards bodies. Now I found that a very curious debate because the CMA already does it. For example, the commitments on cookies with Google expressly require Google to work with the CMA in relation to the W3C standard setting body. So I'm sitting there thinking, they can already do this. Why do you want a law that says something they can already do? And very worrying to any defense practitioners in the room, the proposal that RFIs would need to be continuously updated. So just when you thought your case was finished, you would have fallen under a duty under these House of Lords proposals to keep writing back to the CMA saying, oh yes, when we said that 32% of people were using the product, that's now 33. And they really wanted this stuff, which just tells you they hate big tech, it's political, and it's not based on any particular evidence standard. You might think, of course, you would say that. It was your job to say that. But I'm happy to say that this overreach was pushed back on, so here are the excerpts from the parliamentary papers. Just to give you a bit of a steer, when it says agreed on the right, that means agree to reject. So you can see Kemi Badenoch, the business secretary at the time, reject, 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 reject. So this was not what you would call a particularly successful legislative strategy. However, there was a concession. One of the proposals, which I'm pleased to say was originally mine, was for the guidance document from the DMU you have to be approved by the government, which is controversial because it's technically a breach of independence of agency administration. But anyway, to get to the point, they did spot something, and fair sport, they got us, which was that we hadn't put a deadline on that, and that was no mistake. And that was agreed that there should be a deadline so that it can't just sit in government forever. So there's a summary there of what went on. Perhaps I'm giving too much of an insight into how sausages are made, as the famous phrase has it about legislation. Here we are with a much more refined discussion of quantitative economic effects, and here we are concluding with, instead, all of this horse trading that goes on, and so forth. What's happening next? So let's look forwards for a bit, if that was looking backwards. I mentioned some emergent themes. Now we're going to double tap on them, as they say in the technology companies, before concluding. So one is the symmetric and asymmetric market power point. Another is the important question around product boundaries. When can designated companies enter? Indeed, I think it's a nice segue from the entanglement paper before, because there is the view that someone like Amazon should be able to enter an unrelated market, for example, insurance. What's the problem? But if you're more in that other camp with those Baroque proposals for things like pre-notification, they don't want large companies to enter because they want deconcentration, which of course is fine if deconcentration is your aim. We'll look at a couple of examples of how that's playing out. Data use very quickly. Interestingly, in the parliamentary process, a DMA-like position by which on-platform data would have been restricted if non-public. One of the DMA rules, Article 6.2, if you're up on your DMA, says that a platform company can't take data that's non-public. It's designed to improve contestability. But of course, it's denying scale. It could be good for the world to have that scale. And interestingly, that failed also in the parliamentary process. There's a bit on that. And finally, exclusion versus exploitation. Where exactly are we on that? So, symmetric versus asymmetric. Of course, you want your bridge to be asymmetric, but in many ways, to be symmetric. But in many ways, the point with the Furman review and similar reports is that there is a case for some asymmetry in regulation. I've already spoken to that, so in the interest of time, I'll move on. Product boundaries. This is fascinating. So, as I said, no test later. Don't worry. But section 20, 3 subsection C, contains the retention of a requirement to prove material market power before there is considered to be an issue with tying into another product market. The Act is actually equivocal because there are some places where pushing the use of a product can be a problem. But think about it. If you really boil this down, if you're just introducing a product, let's say you're Google introducing maps way back when, like the street map case from 10 years ago, Right? If you're not incentivizing people, then you're not pushing the product. So you wouldn't fall under that restriction if there are such conduct rules in the future, preventing that type of thing. That's one of the authorized rules. Therefore, the CMA would, you might argue, have to prove material market power changes across the product boundary, which of course is what couldn't be proven in street map because there wasn't a noticeable effect, Judge Roth told us. Now, to get back from the detail, what does that actually mean? It means the law didn't change, right? It's the old rule on technological tying, the one from street map, and it's actually retained in the new law. Of course, there are major changes, but one thing that I love about this area is that it's so finely detailed, right? There are these almost poetic points within the regulation, which sometimes mean that things didn't change. To show you how this is closely tracked by both sides, I might add, this is a red line which we generated on the guidance that came out in the winter, and it shows that the guidance attempted, perhaps inadvertently, perhaps not, to override that point from the legislation. So, of course, we immediately said, excuse me, that's not the law, and it was amended. Data. I mentioned data is interesting. Data is definitely one to watch. Less adversarial. This is just a comment on what's in the debate. Quite interesting to see that there was a bit of a kerfuffle hidden deep in the enforcement sections of the new DMU guidance about foreign data protection law compliance, which is clearly GDPR, and whether you can say, I can't do interoperability because GDPR, which is very clearly coming down the tracks. You can see that from the deletion of footnote 586 from this lengthy guidance document, which had said, because the CMA is operating a competition law, if you then need to comply with our requirements, I'm paraphrasing, that would be a legal basis under GDPR, right? Which would be a big problem for the companies that don't want data interoperability, because then they couldn't say, oh, but privacy, right? Which is one of the current themes. So there were some very firm representations from the platform saying, no, we have to comply with laws, and therefore footnote 586 was deleted. Last but not least, exclusion versus exploitation, very early days, but it's interesting to look at the scope of the designations proposed at the moment, the three I mentioned before, because they seem to be focusing chiefly on exclusionary conduct, not exploitative conduct. The exception is Google search, which refers to whether publishers will get some kind of fair price analysis. In the background, one very interesting thing about the DMCC is that it contains a price-setting power known as the final offer mechanism, which is actually very strong, but it's hard to use. This was contested again in the parliamentary process. In the parliamentary process, it was proposed that you could use this once designated, but that was rejected. You have to show a breach of a conduct rule before it kicks in. But if somebody breaches a conduct rule as a last resort, there is actually this mechanism for arbitration resulting in price setting. Very powerful. Think about some of the debates, things like publishers who think Google has too high a margin, as identified in the 2019 to 20 market study. They'd be able to get final offer arbitration. It's really powerful. But it's interesting, what do you actually do with this? I'm fascinated as an outsider looking in on the DMU. It's a bit like you've got this big red button, but I suppose the thing with that is you shouldn't actually press it, because if you do, what comes next? Just a price cap, no innovation, no competition, Google stays forever, but at a regulated margin, like we were hearing with other regulated industries over the past couple of days. So my final point would be, is this actually that different? Some of this analysis has highlighted considerable similarities with the law that went before. The CMA has actually thrived in some regards using the Enterprise Act and Competition Act powers to do excellent work in a range of technology cases. So while it's true to say that many of the points in the Furman Review were important criticisms, I wonder if really the law did need to change, since we seem to be doing some rather similar things with the new law compared with what went before. Anyway, that's quite enough from me. Remember that cloud matters may well come next, so that will be another indication looking down the tracks of what's coming. And of course, I'm very happy to take any questions.
Okay, We've got a couple of minutes for questions. Any questions? Andreas?
Thanks very much. To take you back to the beginning of your presentation, you described the contrast between the DMA, which is very much rules-based, and the regime we've got here, which doesn't have the guardrails as you described them. Internationally, there's about 8 different regimes emerging, and while the UK and the EU are probably the 2 extremes, the others seem to lie somewhere in between. So I just wonder if you had any thoughts on how these companies should respond to that, and whether you expect the outcome to be gold plating or some kind of more nuanced differentiation in terms of regulatory approaches by jurisdiction. Thank you.
So it's a very good question, also a very difficult one, but I'm happy to answer it. I think the question of whether it's the Brussels effect like it was with the GDPR is a really interesting question. There is quite a lot of objective evidence. I mean, some of my presentation was more policy in character, but there is quite a lot of objective economic evidence that the GDPR and the way that it was followed around the world may well have been harmful, may well have harmed innovation and harmed entry. I would therefore hope that companies will take the advantages of greater flexibility. The fact that DMA-like rules were expressly rejected in the House of Lords process by the government does mean that you could come to the UK and use more data. You could operate Facebook in the UK in a more data-rich way, provided you're not harming anyone. And those European rules, which are a little bit more medieval guild-inspired, the sort of mandating the interoperability because we want 3 Facebooks, or worse, we want a European Facebook, or we will never have one, so let's have interoperation. These sort of vulgarizations of the economic theory. I would hope that people would use the flexibility. That being said, it's pretty clear if you look around the world that it's the DMA and not the DMCC that's being followed, much to the frustration of some of the platforms.
I would just add on that I think there may now, I know there's been a Brussels effect. I think there's going to probably be a US private action effect coming the other way. And I think already some of the things that are happening in the US in terms of remedies could end up influencing what happens not only in the UK, but also in the EU. So I think that there's a lot of learning going in every direction. And the US has now kind of accidentally, not accidentally, but not with the DOJ or FTC support or governmental support, become a really big mover in this space. Okay, so I think we should leave it there and have, oh, Russell, you wanted to, oh, okay, very good. I'll hand over to Sean just to close.
All right, thank you very much. I think this conference has really gone very well from my perception, so thank you all for being here, joining us, contributing to an excellent and deep discussion across many different topics, but all united by a common interest in quality of research and policy. This is time for thank you. So thank you very much to the team that has been involved with preparing this event. Especially I would point out Peter Courage, Juliet Hardman, the people in the back room behind the black glass. Thank you very much. I would like to thank our sponsor for the conference, Clifford Chance, and more broadly for the CCP. I would like also to thank our speakers, our panelists, and the audience here who has been you've all been very active and really contributed to bringing this event to fruition today. So thanks very much, and we'll see you next year.